Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Gina Bryant and I am the webinar facilitator for the Best and Brightest company to work for. Before we begin today's webinar, I just have a few quick announcements. Today's broadcast is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit with SHRM and HRCI. In order to receive your credit, please fill out the survey from SurveyMonkey that will be emailed to you later on this afternoon. Our broadcast today is being recorded and will be available to view on the Best and Brightest website next week. If you have any questions during this broadcast, please use the chat feature you see in the lower left-hand portion of your screen. We will have a Q&A session at the end of this webinar. As mentioned, today's webinar is Balancing the Scales, Tips to Initiating and Sustaining Corporate Workplace Equality During Racial Unrest. Our webinar today is sponsored by FONA International and Now Health. Thank you both. Our presenter today is Sandy Harvey. Sandy is the founder and president of Exodus Consulting Group. She supports individuals and organizations by aligning business processes, systems, and people to achieve individual and corporate goals. As a certified diversity professional, she passionately helps organizations improve efficiency and collaboration by embracing diversity and inclusion strategies. Sandy is committed to creating engaged and profitable companies that enhance the lives of individuals through professional development and innovation. I want to thank everyone for joining us. I'm going to turn the call over now to our presenter, Sandy Harvey.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here with you and really to talk about a very timely topic, balancing the scales and really sharing some information about what questions I've received and even activities that have been performed over these last few months. And it's important to know that when we're talking about, civil and racial unrest, I did add the civil unrest because we're also in the middle of a pandemic. And that doesn't matter what part of the country you're in, we're pretty much in the same boat. And so that has a lot of impact on balancing the scales and really the work that needs to be done by organizations and opportunities that as key professionals and organizations that you can do. So the first thing that I definitely want to start off with is there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to this. Every organization is different. Cultures are different. There are so many parameters around the work that you do that there's not a one-size-fits-all. And so I wanted to start with that, but even as we go throughout this webinar, we will, again, as Gina mentioned, stop a little bit early so you can we can talk about the questions or comments that you have. So please put those in the chat feature as well. So no one-size-fits-all, no blueprint. There are some best practices and key items that you definitely want to consider, but these are some of the things that I've come across over the past few months that I'm excited to share with you. So the first thing that we have is just a question about how has your organization responded to the recent civil and racial unrest. And so you have time, I'll give you a few seconds to respond to that, and then we will close the poll and look at our results. So has your organization responded very well? Well, we remained silent, not well, or you just need to do a restart. Start all over again. It looks like we have almost half responding. Okay, so we'll look at our results right now. with about half of the participants responding. And this is very exciting to see that for most of the organizations, pretty much about 75%, you have responded very well. Your organization has responded very well or well. And then there's some that have remained silent, not well, or just need a restart. So thank you for that information. So as we continue, if you're as old as I am, and I'm born in 69, so you do the math. But Who Moved My Cheese was a huge hit in the late 90s, early 2000s. This was the great motivator around change and change in organizations. Some of you may remember Who Moved My Cheese, but this is really talking about change in businesses and change in organization, and why do we keep going to the same place or doing the same things expecting different results? And so as you probably have noticed, over these past few months, the landscape of work has changed. So remote work is here to stay. I know some organizations and some of my clients really had difficulty around, having their team members work remotely even prior to the pandemic. But now here we are. And so we are in this state where we are working remotely, but guess what? If we're working remotely, we're also have a little bit more contact with the news and with what's going on. And so the activities and the social activities and environmental things around us are really a part of what we are experiencing. So while the landscape has changed, we're working remotely, we're working in most cases at home, our business world and our personal lives, they're intertwined. It starts and stops, from a day, but it's really intertwined now a lot. And so when we think about what is some of the work that needs to be done, statistically, it is proven that organizations that have leaders with a higher emotional intelligence is considered to be a more valuable organization as far as engagement and as it relates to profitability than those that have leaders that are focused on their intelligence or technical skills. So one of the things that's important now, even as we talk about, the civil and racial unrest, is securing the best leaders. Leaders that were micromanagers in the office, their team members experienced it 10 times as much because they're not in the office. So the phone calls every day, even if they're 15 minutes, it can appear like that's overkill. That's a little bit too much. So when we think about what can we do to provide the best environment for our team members, even though we're not together, we definitely have to look at all of the components of someone's work life, and which also means their personal life. Some of the challenges that were presented to me early on was we are expecting for people to work remotely, and some of the employment population does not have internet access at work. So when we talk about, let's just pick up and move, we can't do that. I had a client that they did not have laptops. They only had desktops. So the intent really was you only work in the office. So when we're thinking about as it relates to what is it that we can do, we have to look at the entire landscape of the work that we're doing in order to provide safety for our team members, but also to really be able to engage. So, how you're engaging your team members is extremely important. Are you doing it based on what they need, or you're doing it for your own comfort? And as we talk about this, one of the things that really struck me was the pledges after the George Floyd death. And, you know, it's important that we do have our organizations are sensitive. They should be very aware. But my question for those of you in the leadership roles or that are really playing a role in there is, what's your why? Why create the statement now? What does the statement mean? Why is the statement important to your organization? And when we think about this, I want to also bring up the fact that if you have solid core values in your organization, if you are holding team members accountable to the core values, and your core values say something very similar or support a statement or diversity statement, that is something to refer back to. We've been holding on to our core values, and we're lifting this up as something that we can do better, opposed to putting out a different statement and it becomes a marketing statement. Because if it's not measurable or it's hard to measure, I've seen some wonderful statements that, I mean, were heartfelt. But how do you measure that within the organization? How does a team member see that lived out within the organization? And so when we're thinking about our statements and our pledges, it's important to do this, but also make sure the timing is right to do that, and then that you understand how it will be measured. So is it diverse candidates? Is it posting positions within a particular demographic group in order to increase the level of diversity, or veterans, or LGBTQ? I mean, what is it that organizations intend to do and carry forward to really show that there is a change in what's being done? Which brings me to something that I call this or that, because when we think about equity, racial equity, one picture that I always love is the picture of equality and equity. And when you look at this, hopefully it comes to mind that, you know, equality is good. You give everybody the same thing and then they just figure it out. But equity is much better, because in this particular picture, if we all can't see, even though we have a particular tool to help us, this to me is what we see in organizations where could be a level of favoritism, or, you know, organizations generally have their own level of bullies within the organization. So, you know, what is the major message that you see in this picture, and then how do you equate that to what you see within your own organization? And as we kind of talk about, you know, diversity and inclusion and racial equity, how are your positions posted internally? These are some of the questions that I posed to clients. What is it that, is there a mentoring program for maybe women of color? What is the landscape of your executive team? What does that team look like? And when we're thinking about equality and equity, this happens in every organization. So we have to think about, when we're talking about equity, the reality is I am looking at the need for that particular team or that particular team member. And so I've really put some bullet points together, which I thought would kind of break this down a little bit more. When we see equality, it's, you know, we're seeking equal treatment for everybody. We're offering people the same solution. actions are generally the same for all. It's an outcome, and it's the golden rule. And the golden rule is treat everyone as you would like to be treated. But when we think about equity, we think that individual actions that are needed or desired are tailored for that particular person or that particular team. We understand and we better recognize differences. Employees have what they need in order to be successful. Because if you say, well, these are all the tools of the trade, if it's not something that I need in order to be successful, it means nothing to me, and it becomes a barrier to my success. Equity is an ongoing process. It helps us evolve, especially in organizations when we think about inclusion. And then there's also the platinum rule. So the golden rule is to treat someone as they would like to be treated. The platinum rule is, that you would treat me as I would like to be treated. So golden rule, treat me as I'm treating you as I want to be treated, and I hope that works out okay, and that you treat me, very well and respectful because that's the way that I treat you. That doesn't always happen. And then the platinum rule is really looking at it from the standpoint of how is it that person needs to be treated? What would make them feel most included? And then how can we go about providing them the need that would make them most successful? And I look at this every time when we're talking about diversity and inclusion in my organization, we look at it from a standpoint of emotional intelligence. It is very difficult to understand inclusion, diversity. It's difficult to understand a lot of things if you are not self-aware, or if your ultimate goal is not to create relationships that are for the benefit of all. So when we think about emotional intelligence, that to me is a starting point for a lot of different organizations. So when I think about equity, when we think about equality, you have two different avenues or tools here. Yes, they're both important. And if you have to start someplace, you can start with equality and then move to equity or incorporate that. But from a standpoint of what's valuable to me, it's equity. And I think about it, for those of you that are parents, I'm the youngest child. My mother said we all had different personalities, and we all like different, vegetables. She says, you guys were not the same. And if she had treated us all the same way, it would have been less of an impact on our lives as opposed to taking the time to give us really what we needed. And so that's important when we talk about equality and equity, and it is heavy lifting. It is hard work. That's why having great leaders is extremely important along this process, because organizationally it's difficult if you have a leader that is maybe a bully. I've had situations where someone was banging their fist on the table and using profanity, and this was a senior executive, and the CEO said, well, they're just passionate. Can everybody get away with that? So it's really how you look at it within your organization, what is tolerated, what is allowed, and then what is it that you see is most important within your organization? How do we get to equity? How do we get to making sure that we understand and really work to meet the needs of those that are in the organization? That's important because the more engaged your team members are, the more profitable they are, the more likely they are to stay, there are a lot of benefits to making sure that individuals within your organization feel fully engaged and also have the experience that I know many of you are trying to share within your organization. So there's the workplace diversity statistics. There's an article that has 80-plus workplace diversity statistics, and I pulled out a few, but the point is here is, measure what matters, and do you know what matters within your organization? So if you are in an organization that your executive team is not diverse, what can you do about it? There's pay disparity that we have to look at as well. So if you think about from the standpoint of women, and this is women overall, because there's a pay disparity between men and women, that oftentimes women within organizations, once they retire, they have made so much less over the years that oftentimes some are in very low income or impoverished situations because of the lack of income that they've made over the years. And so when we think about compounding, there's a gap in there. And so we really have to be aware of that. I've experienced that in workplaces and just speaking with individuals where a man is in one role and a female is in another role, and there's a $20,000 gap, even though the experience and the education is the same. And so when we think about what we're doing in our organizations, we have the opportunity to really make a difference. So some of the things that stuck out to me is, 2018, the unemployment rate for persons with a disability rose to 8%, which is double the national average of 3.7 at that time. 2024, formerly seen minority groups will be the majority status. 43% of companies with diverse boards notice higher profits. And so when we think about, racial and the civil unrest, if we remain silent, then nothing happens. So in organizations where we see what's happening on TV, we see there's a racial unrest. I received a call yesterday, you have team members that want to go out and protest. What do you have a policy for or against that? Are they able to do that? And those are things that you have to consider as an organization. Diverse companies are significantly better positioned, 70% more to capture new markets. So when you think about the workplace diversity statistics out there, there's an opportunity for us to look at how do we manage the unrest that's outside that sometimes creeps in. It creeps in because we see it, we hear it, and it's unfortunate, but then not having a conversation about it, and it takes courageous conversations, not having a conversation about it can be detrimental in the integrity and then also trust within the workplace. So one of the things that I thought about is, when there's an opportunity for us to look at history, and you can't erase history, but history helps us put things in perspective, and it helps us guide us to a better place. So we are not perfect. Organizations are not perfect. People are not perfect, but we have to own our mistakes and not hide them, and also be willing to have courageous conversations around race, ethnicity, gender. A lot of organizations that have found the opportunity to have these conversations find that there's a lot more fluidity in people talking to one another, and even team members being able to talk to their leaders. We have to inquire and don't assume that we know. Silence, as I mentioned, is not acceptance, so we have to make sure it is acceptance. So we have to make sure that, sometimes it's like, okay, well, we're just not going to say anything and it'll just pass. And I've even kind of wondered that is, will this time pass? What will we do? It seemed like the pandemic that we're in, that's a civil unrest. Wearing a mask, that's civil unrest. So there are different things that happen that are presented to us that really we have to determine how do we manage these things organizationally, but then also individually. Acknowledge areas of bias. We all have biases. It's really trying to be aware and more self-aware to acknowledge areas of biases, and then also be willing to overcome those or be more aware of them, that they don't happen and don't happen as much. When we think about the execution part of what we can do, training is not a solution, it's an action. Oftentimes I'll get, well, we just need diversity training. Well, training without a strategy or training without follow-up or training without expectation, and that's on any type of training, is really very difficult in saying, I just want to do training. If it's awareness, if it's a conversation, those can look very different. Change, when we think about it, we have to have change that's organizational. We need to look at milestones. We need to look at what is it that you're measuring. So within your organization, how are you measuring progress around diversity and inclusion? And then within the organization, sometimes we don't know because we're not a part of that, but how can we disband social, racial, and economic barriers within the workplace? So again, if there's pay disparity, if you have not ever attempted to hire veterans, do that. Do something different and make sure that you're doing it in a way that you intend to be inclusive. There's a big desire to be inclusive. But when we're talking about executing and looking at this, we have to have a strategy around what we're doing. Sometimes, and I'll go back to some of the diversity statements by many major organizations, is that there's a statement that's made, but how and the intent to do it is not there. And so someone else has to figure it out. And as you'll see, as I'll share in a few minutes, it's not necessarily HR's role to figure that out. And so for those of you that are HR leaders or business partners, you can send me kudos, thank you later. But I found that diversity is most difficult to execute when it lies in the hands of human resources. Human resources has a lot of other things to do, but your diversity and inclusion strategy has to come from the top. So when we think about the implementation process, one acronym that I like to use is ACE. So assess where you are. Everybody is going to be in a different place. And then where do you desire to go? I had a conversation with individuals yesterday. Where do you want to go? Where do you want your organization to be? What do you want people to feel or to think about your organization? Commit to reasonable and sustainable actions. We could probably all think of some super huge, big ideas and thoughts, but the reality is if it's not reasonable, then you'll be discouraged, and we'll see failure, and then we'll stop. Or we'll say, oh, that doesn't work. But when we think about the opportunity for us to be able to commit to reasonable and sustainable actions, those are things that we really need to look for. So maybe for you, for your organization just starting out, maybe you're having conversations around using TED Talks and doing lunch and learn. But as you make things mandatory, you want to start having conversations, but the conversations also have to be very fluid, and then they also have to be engaging for team members. And then execute. So in a methodical and measurable manner. And what does that look like? That goes back to assessing. It goes back to a strategy. If you've implemented a software system, there's generally milestones that you have to complete in order to make sure that you're on track. If you are, launching a new product, there are generally milestones, things that you measure. And so when we're talking about executing as it relates to diversity and inclusion, and even thinking about, the unrest that's around us, it also creeps into our organizations. And then also, in addition to that, we have to make sure that we are fully aware that because we're all across the country, sometimes team members experience different things based on where they are. It's really digging into and just asking the question. And I found that has been the easiest thing to do, is just ask the question, how do you feel? Or, tell me what's going on. Those types of questions really begin to demonstrate that you care and that you are aware that something is happening, as opposed to nothing is happening and not saying anything. So our last few slides really just kind of focus on some of the things that you can do. Compensation and promotion. Review compensation for team members. If you've never done this, now's a good time to do it. In my past, I would do this periodically. So every 3 years or so, we would do a compensation study just to make sure within our market, make sure that as the environment around us has changed, as we've changed and added extra pieces to job descriptions, in addition to the all other duties as assigned, that we haven't changed the role fundamentally, therefore needing to change the pay. Pay disparity for women, especially for women of color, it's life-altering. Are we aware of that? And then what are we doing with that? Talent acquisition. These are just some of the things that I've come across. You may have a wonderful program within your organization, but are all openings posted? Do you post your openings internally? Or, which I've seen happen, and many of us have seen it, where somebody just taps you on the shoulder and say, oh, I think you'll be good for this. And then that becomes a part of someone's history because they've been pegged for a job that was never open posted. We don't really investigate the skill level of all of the team members. But looking at that, does your organization post with diverse associations in the organization? So you have many minority organizations. You have the National Black MBA Association. You have the NAAA-HR, which is the Association for African American and Human Resources Professionals. And you have your Latina, your Hispanic MBA. So there are a lot of different veterans organizations. Even with the state of Michigan, there are opportunities to really kind of segment just to make sure your posting is getting to all people, and not just, oh, well, we only post on LinkedIn or we only post, on Indeed. Do you have an active referral program? And then one of the things that I've experienced and that I've really worked with our leaders, and one time in one organization it took me about 14 months, but I would challenge the word fit. Many of you in HR, or if you're in a leadership role, we are okay with saying, well, they're just not a good fit. Well, what does fit mean? And define it according to the job description. Because generally fit means, well, I didn't jive with them as well as I did someone else. So when we think about fit, I would begin to say, okay, let's walk through that this is not a good fit. So we would have to not use that word and then find out really what are you getting down to. I didn't jive with them as much, or, what's the real issue? And then also, as it relates to talent acquisition, access does not mean opportunity. Because you say I posted a position doesn't necessarily mean that the opportunity is afforded even through interviews. We have talent acquisition systems. We look for keywords on our resumes that can really challenge. I can tell you, if you have been in the military, your words on your application or your resume are not the same type of business words that we would see on a general resume, but they're transferable skills. Before, way back in my day, we would look at resumes and we would say, okay, well, this person could be a really good fit for this position. Now we have systems to do that, and sometimes that does not always give us the opportunity to be as diverse as possible within the organization. Accountability. So is there an expectation that all team members are respectful, even the leadership? Or do you have leaders that are bullies, and then that's accepted? Is communication free-flowing? So does everyone have the opportunity to hear and see the same information? How diverse is your leadership team? How diverse are your board of directors? Do your written values. So the values that you have written out, do they really match your culture? And what I mean by that is, if you walk into an organization, or you walk into a store, or you walk into any place, people will say, oh, we're so friendly. But if you walk into a store and no one ever acknowledges you or says anything to you, well, the store's not really friendly. So those are values that we may put on the wall, or we may have, painted walls, because these are our values, or we have little pocket cards. But what's your true culture? Asking someone from the outside to kind of help assess that, or even, I've done that in the past, is have, trusted confidants really provide you information on what do they see on your website? What does your collateral say? And then make sure you're measuring what matters most. So next, talking about culture starts at the top. This whole process of equality starts at the top. It starts with the leadership team, the senior leadership team. It cannot be driven by human resources. It's a very difficult process. And when human resources in organizations where they attempt to do that, sometimes it's not the buy-in. They don't have the buy-in from their leadership team like they would like. Is your marketing collateral racially sensitive, or gender sensitive, or LGBTQ sensitive, or veteran sensitive? Who are you marketing to? Which goes back to, very similarly, where are you posting your positions? some of the things, I had an individual say that they were looking for diverse candidates to apply for attorney positions, and I asked, where are you posting the position, to get diverse candidates? And they told me that they post on the U of M alumni page. And I merely said, I'm not sure how diverse of candidates you will get only by posting on the U of M alumni page. But there are other places that you can post in order to be able to receive diverse candidates. And then how are courageous conversations encouraged? So within your organization, and these are, are you able to work through conflict? Are you emotionally aware? So the EQ is high within your organization. It's okay to ask team members questions. Is your culture set up that way to where you provide this safe, respectful environment? Bullying is no longer acceptable when we talk about leadership. We talked about, being emotionally intelligent. And then also senior leaders are accountable for action. One thing that even team members, everyone within organizations have to be aware of is we're still employed technically even after 5 o'clock. And in my past, I had a CEO tell us, if you, get pulled over or if something happens to you, put on the shirt of our competitor, but take our shirt off. And so when we think about all the things that happen, our lives don't change because it's 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock or 4 o'clock or whatever time your day ends, especially now that most of us are working within our home and our workplace. And then what is your organizational commitment to board diversity? So when we think about corporate boards or board diversity, nonprofit boards, or even within your organization, if you have a private board or advisory board, what's your commitment to board diversity? As I mentioned before, the HR team cannot be organizational enforcers, but they should be strategic partners. So this is the opportunity for HR to begin to manage and measure where people-centric activities happen. Metrics and reporting should be required from HR. And then identify and eliminate internal systems that are barriers to racial diversity, racial equity, and then that also tend to ostracize or leave others that are different from us outside. And so when we think about the things that, these are just kind of some of the comments and questions that have come up for me over the last 2-3 months, but then also from the standpoint of as we are looking to, it's not a new normal, it's a next normal, because I can't tell you, even for those that are experiencing their parents, what do you do with parents who have children they're not sure or they're uncomfortable sending their kids to school? That's the civil unrest. These are all of the things that are happening within organizations right now. Is how are companies able to support individuals in really living out their lives, but also being as engaged and successful as they can be within the organization. So as we kind of move, and Gina will be ready for some questions, but I just put the kind of social media there so you can feel free to connect with me, especially on LinkedIn if you haven't already, but we can open it up for questions now.
Great, thanks, Sandy. One of the questions that came through, which you might have already answered because it came in early, was how do you achieve equity?
It's hard work, especially in the workplace. The individuals that are most able to do that are leaders that are engaged with their team members. Sometimes from an HR standpoint, we think onboarding is a magic bullet. We just tell a lot of people different things, all the information that we can and tell them about our organization. But then at some point it's a relationship of finding out what an individual needs or desires. And it's like the friendships that we have. Some are really deep and solid friendships, and others you have to kind of work on them a little bit to really find out. So when you're thinking about equity within the workplace, one of the things I found out, equity is, okay, everybody's not able to work at home. Why? Maybe they don't have a laptop and the organization isn't providing it for them. Another reason, maybe they don't have internet access in their home. And that could be for a lot of different reasons. So when we're thinking about equity, it's really finding out about the individual and the individual's needs, but that sometimes comes out through your engagement surveys of what your team member base actually needs and desires. So hopefully I covered that.
A couple more questions.
Sure.
What is your evidence for pay disparity based on gender?
So pay disparity, if you go to, I'll give you a couple of resources. McKinsey & Company, you can sign up. They have a lot of information. Also, Lean In, a lot of statistical information on pay disparity. And it's historic, but it also gives you the information that you would need in order to kind of measure that. But also within your organization and within doing a comparative study, comparative compensation study is very helpful if you've not ever done that. It is, you want to do a market study, but also it's not just looking at salary, it's also looking at your job descriptions as well. And then comparing that, who's your competitor within this region, and being able to do that as well. Sometimes we're like, oh, we just need to pay people more and they'll be happy. That's not the case.
Okay. Our next question came from Nikki. How do you recommend metrics and measurables are applied during DEI strategic planning process?
So, I use the metrics from, there's two ways. So I match your employment metrics, but then also the metrics, what's the strategic plan? So hopefully, and not all organizations have that, many more are moving towards that, of being able to strategically address and assess what they want to do for a DEI strategic plan. So for instance, if I know my current leadership, and this may be your executive team and the leaders that report directly to them, if there are maybe I have 5% women, strategically you can map out a plan to increase that over a period of time. So it's what's most important for the organization. And again, as I mentioned, it's not a one-size-fits-all, but it's looking at it from the standpoint of what is it that we want to do within the organization. It is almost impossible. I have a partner that, they've identified over 50 diversity metrics, measurements that are in the organization. So it's an opportunity to look at specifically within the organization, or you can even manage from the standpoint of doing hiring how many diverse candidates are we reaching? How many veterans are we reaching? There are a lot of different statistics out there that can be used as a part of the diversity strategic planning process.
Okay, our next question comes from Verna. Where should you start when establishing diversity goals?
That's a great question. And it's not a one-size-fits-all. When we talk about diversity strategy and diversity goals, it really depends on your organization. So if you are, a nonprofit, or is it the client base, what is it that you want to reach more diverse clients, you want to have a more diverse board, you want to see the number of incidents, within the organization decrease, so conflicts. Maybe it's even around the number of performance improvement plans. So your activities become more relational as opposed to more disciplinary. So there's different ways that you can look at establishing diversity goals, Verna, and you can always reach out. But there are different ways that you can do that. But it really, really depends on your organization, and it has to really be coupled with what your leadership team is also willing to support. And so those things are really very important.
Great, thank you. Shauna asked, how do you convince leadership to get on board when they are indifferent regarding equity and inclusion?
You can't. You can, and that's a very good question, Shauna. That's where, when it comes to just exposure and self-awareness, emotional intelligence is extremely important leading any diversity and inclusion and equity initiative. Because if you're not self-aware, or if you think it's no big deal, we don't need to do anything, or you have a group that is indifferent to it, those are things that it's very difficult in order to be able to say, okay, I'm going to send you to this training, or we'll have this training, and then their minds or eyes or hearts will be open. But when we think about the opportunity to expose leaders, that's what we have. That's why Lunch and Learn, soft informational opportunities are really good in providing exposure and really instigating conversations around diversity and inclusion. So that's an opportunity. You can't convince anyone to do anything different. I do remember many years ago, very, very large global companies that I provided diversity and inclusion training for, and it was kind of two-pronged. It was, I would have people come to class and they said, well, I'm only here because I have to be here. And I'm like, nah, you don't really have to be here. No, my supervisor, they told me I have to be here. Well, the reality is, after they stayed in the class, and there were a few that I said, really, you don't have to be here, and that opted to leave. But I do remember having participants in the class saying, I'm so glad that I stayed, or I'm so glad that we had this. I was skeptical at the beginning, but just hearing this, I never knew that I was racist and teaching my kids to be the same thing, or I never knew that I was homophobic and I was teaching my children to do the exact same thing. And so exposure and information is really pivotal especially now. They may be short videos, but there are tons of opportunities, TEDx videos that you can use as conversation starters, but also establishing some safety and some barriers, around that. Maybe it's just a group of 25 or a group of 20, and they want to participate and be a part of. And so that's an opportunity to get the information out there, because the change and transition will really be pushed by team members, but it has to be initiated and by your highest leadership team.
Thank you, Sandy. That looks like all of our questions for today.
Awesome.
I just want to thank FONA International and Now Health again for sponsoring this webinar. Thank you, Sandy Harvey, for all the valuable information you gave us today. Remember that you will receive a survey this afternoon. If you need to receive a SHRM or HRCI credits, please fill that out. Today's webinar was recorded. We will have it available next week on the Best and Brightest website. You can also register for any of our upcoming webinars there as well. Thanks again, Sandy. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. Be safe and stay healthy.